told you that story reminds me of why I love you so much.
So tell me, what is one thing you have done in your life that if you could go back in time, you would stop yourself from doing it? Take your time, because most people will say a relationship, a bad decision, a missed opportunity.
Well, thank you for the question. Everyone has a story to tell, but me? If I could remove one thing from my life, it would not be my marriage. It would be the voices. Because the voices didn't just advise me, they replaced my own thoughts before I even noticed I had stopped thinking for myself. The voices I allowed into my head, the ones that came dressed as advice, the ones that smiled at my face and quietly poisoned everything I had. I met my husband when he had nothing. No money, no car, just him, just me. And something we didn't have a name for back then, but we felt it every single day. Peace of mind. We used to sit outside in the evening, just the two of us, laughing, jesting, not going anywhere, not needing to. Back then, I used to say, as long as I have him, I am okay. And I meant it, every single word. Or at least, I thought I did. My husband used to do things for me. They were not big things. Nobody would post them on social media. Nobody would call them romantic gestures. But they were real. And real is the one thing money cannot manufacture. If I complained about a headache, he would not hand me a tablet and walk away. He would sit beside me and massage my head with warm water, slowly, until I slept off right there in his hands. If the food at home was not enough for both of us, he would look at me and say he was not hungry, and I would eat. Only later did I understand he was always hungry. He just loved me more than his hunger. And I treated it like it was nothing, like it was something I was entitled to, not something he was quietly sacrificing for me. Some mornings I would wake up and the water was already fetched. He had risen before dawn, quietly, so I could sleep a little longer. Some evenings when exhaustion had swallowed me whole, he would wash the plates himself, even when I told him not to, even when I insisted. He would just smile and say, "Go and rest." And every single night, no matter how heavy his day had been, no matter what had gone wrong out there, he would find me before he slept and ask, "Are you okay? Hope you are good." Every night, without fail. Those things used to mean everything to me because they were not performed. They were not for anyone's watching. They were just him, loving me in the only language he knew. Things did not change suddenly. That is the thing about slow poison. You don't taste it at first. Life got a little better for us. We got a better job. We moved into a small apartment in a quiet estate. I remember the first night we slept there. We stayed up late, just talking, just laughing, too excited to close our eyes. And my husband, he did not change. If anything, he was even better than before. More settled, more present. Life was not perfect, but it was ours. And then after a year and a half, our first child came. The way that man held our baby, like it was made of something the world had never seen before. I would wake up some nights and find him just standing over the cot, not doing anything, just watching our child breathe. He was not a perfect man. He forgot dates. He was not the type to plan surprises or show up with flowers. Nothing like those husbands you see performing love on the internet. But he was there, every morning, every night, every ordinary moment in between. And I had learned by then that there is something money cannot buy. Presence. The kind that doesn't disappear when things get hard. I had that. I had all of that. Then I met the women, new friends in the estate, women who looked like they had everything together, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, always talking about the good life, luxury this, standards that. They called themselves estate boss ladies. There was one of them, the one who spoke the most, always smiling, always calm, the kind of woman who sounded right even when she was completely wrong. At first, it was just conversation over tea, light talk, harmless laughter. But conversations have a way of becoming classrooms if you are not careful who is teaching. Slowly, they started asking about my marriage, and I would tell them it is fine. My husband is trying, and the laughter that followed was not the warm kind. Just fine? One of them said it, the way you say it to someone you pity. She asked if I had a car. I said no. She said, so I still take the estate bus. I said yes. She leaned back, looked at me the way a doctor looks at a bad scan result, and said, that is a disaster at its peak. She said I deserved more. And the other one nodded and said I had to push him. Because men, she said, will never rise to what is expected unless you push them. They told me about their own husbands, how they pushed, how they refused to settle, how the men eventually delivered. They made it sound like a formula, like pressure was love, like discomfort was strategy. And slowly, those words began to find a home in me. That was when I started noticing things I had never noticed before. The way my husband repeated clothes, the way he thought before every purchase, calculated, careful. The way he would say, let's manage this month, before. That phrase felt like teamwork. Now it felt like failure. Even the things I once loved about him started to feel like evidence against him. When he asked, are you okay? The question I once waited for every night now sounded like noise to me. I would hear it and feel nothing. When he could not afford something expensive, I would measure him against the estate men. I stopped seeing what he gave. I started cataloging what he lacked. It didn't feel like I was changing. It felt like I was finally seeing clearly. That's how dangerous it was. And the most painful part, he was still the same man. He had not changed. He was still waking up early, still asking if I was okay, still putting me first without announcement. He was still being the man I once got on my knees and prayed for. But I had new eyes now. And new eyes can destroy what faithful eyes once protected. I remember the first time I humiliated him. We were at a small gathering. Someone made a joke about men who could not afford expensive things. And before I could think, I laughed. And I said, some people here need to be ashamed of themselves. And I looked at him. The whole room understood and they laughed. But he didn't. His hand tightened slightly around the glass in front of him. Not enough to break it, just enough to hold himself together. He just sat there and something in his face shifted. Not anger, something quieter than anger. Something that looked like grief. That night, he barely spoke. And before we slept, he turned to me and asked just one question. Do you still respect me? I said nothing. Because in my mind, I believed I was right. I believed I was building him. I believed the discomfort was necessary. I told myself what the estate boss lady had told me. First stage, denial. He'll thank you later. So I didn't answer him, and he turned away. And the silence that filled that room, I should have listened to it. I started pressuring him openly after that, complaining, comparing, picking at everything. And he changed. Not suddenly, but I watched it happen. The joke stopped. The lightness in him faded. He would come home and go quiet in a way he never used to. The man who once filled every evening with laughter started to feel like a stranger sitting across from me. And I told myself that was progress, that the discomfort was working, that he was being refined, until the day everything finally broke. I don't know how it escalated the way it did. I could have stopped it. I chose not to. It started the way most of our arguments started by then. I was talking about money, about how he was not doing enough, about how life should look different by now. But this time, he did not absorb it quietly. He looked at me, tired in a way that went beyond that day. Tired in the way of someone who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. And he said, when did you become like this? I felt the accusation in it and I pushed back. Like what? He shook his head slowly. We used to be okay. What changed? I laughed, but there was nothing funny in my chest. You call this okay? Watching everyone else live properly while we are here just managing? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Since when did our marriage become a competition?" And something about that question made me angrier. Since I started seeing what real men actually do for their wives. He stared at me like he was looking for someone he recognized. And he said quietly, "When did these people start deciding what enough looks like for you?" And I said, "It is because you are not man enough." And I meant it. In that moment, I truly meant it. And I deserve better. He didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at me. And I should have stopped there. Every part of me that still loved him should have stopped there. But I didn't. The room was silent. He was still looking at me with those tired eyes. Still looking at me. Waiting like there was still something left that could be saved. And I opened my mouth. And I said, "I regret marrying you." I have replayed that moment 10,000 times since then. The way the air changed when those words left me. The way his face went. Not angry. Not hurt in the way you recover from. But empty. Like a candle that had finally run out of wax. He nodded once, slowly, picked up his phone from the table, and walked out. I did not follow him. I did not call his name. I sat there in my anger like it was armor, telling myself he would come back. He always came back. But something about the way the door closed that night didn't sound like something that was coming back. That's what he used to do. He stayed.
Night came. The apartment was too quiet. I called him. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I told myself he needed air, that by morning everything would reset, that this was just another argument. Then an unknown number lit up my screen. A woman's voice, calm in the way that means something is wrong. She asked if I was the wife of the owner of the number. I said yes. She said I should come to the hospital, that there had been an accident, that my husband was involved. I do not remember the journey there. I do not remember how I got through the doors. Everything felt louder than it should have been. Footsteps, voices, movement. Like the world was continuing normally in a moment that should have stopped everything. The first thing I saw when I arrived was his shoes, sitting outside the door of a room. His shoes, the same ones he had walked out of our house in. And then I saw him, but not the way I had ever seen him before. He was lying there on that bed, surrounded by machines, tubes, the sound of things keeping him here by force. Quiet, in a way that did not feel like sleep. They told me a car hit him while he was crossing the road. He was not dead, but he was not there either. He was somewhere between, and no one could tell me which direction he would go. I sat beside him every day. I held his hand, the same hand that used to massage my head with warm water, and I talked to him. I told him I didn't mean it. I told him I was wrong. I told him about our child, about the evening we stayed up all night in our new apartment because we were too excited to sleep. I begged him to open his eyes, just once, just so I could take back what I said. But there was no response. The machines breathed for him, and I sat there, day after day, carrying the weight of the last words I had spoken to him. Days became weeks, and every single day I replayed that sentence, over and over again, hoping somehow it would change. And then one morning, the doctor called me aside. His voice was gentle in the way that doctors learn to be when the news is the worst kind. He said, "I'm sorry, Ma. We did everything we could, but we couldn't save him." I nodded like I understood. But the truth was, Nothing in me understood how life could continue after that sentence. I stood in that corridor and I felt something leave me. Not just grief, something deeper than grief. Because the last real conversation I had with my husband was me standing in our home telling him I regretted him. That was the last thing he heard from me. That was what I sent him out into the world carrying, and he never came back for me to undo it. If I had just protected what I had, instead of chasing a life that was never even real, he would still be here. Now, let me tell you what I learned. What I learned too late. Those women, those same women who sat with me, who laughed with me, who poured those voices into my head and called it wisdom. When my husband was lying in that hospital, not one of them came. I called the one who started it all, the first lady of the group, the one with all the answers. Her phone rang out. I sent a message. She read it. No reply. Minutes passed, then hours. Still nothing. That was when I understood the voices had never belonged to me. And now they were gone. The others were suddenly busy, suddenly unavailable, suddenly unable to find their way to a hospital they could have reached in 10 minutes. It was just me, alone in that ward, with the weight of my own words and no one left to carry them for me. And when he didn't make it, I didn't just lose a husband. I lost the only person in my life who had ever chosen to stay. Not for status, not for what I could offer, just me. And after everything, life did not pause to let me mourn properly. Reality arrived immediately. Bills, responsibilities, a child too young to understand, but old enough to keep asking, "Where is Daddy?" And I had no answer that didn't break me. I could not keep up with the rent. I was evicted. My things were placed outside like they no longer belonged anywhere. And my child stood beside me, holding my hand, looking at me like I was supposed to fix it. I packed what I could carry and left that estate. The same estate where those women had taught me that what I had was not enough. None of them were there when the landlord changed the locks. Not one of them offered a room. Not one of them sent money. Not one phone call. Nothing. The life they had sold me, they could not even lend me a piece of it when I had nothing. That was when I finally understood. Not everyone who speaks into your life is speaking to grow you. Some people speak from emptiness. They tear down what they cannot build. Some people don't even know what they have in their own homes, so they will never recognize what is standing in front of you. And some are simply pouring their own bitterness into your cup and calling it advice. Marriage is not a competition. It is not a measuring contest. It is not something you hold up against your neighbor's life and judge. It lives in the person who stays beside you when there is nothing impressive to stay for. It lives in warm water on a headache, in a man who says he is not hungry so you can eat, in a question asked every night without fail, "Are you okay?" I had all of that, and I looked at it and called it not enough. Now I am here, raising our child alone, doing everything that was supposed to be shared, all by myself. And the hardest part is not the struggling. The struggling I can survive. The hardest part is knowing that I had peace, genuine, quiet, unshakable peace, and I took it apart with my own hands because someone else told me it wasn't good enough. So if you have something real, protect it, not because it is perfect, but because real is rare. And most people don't know they had it until they're forced to live without it. Do not let outside voices walk into something sacred and rearrange it. Do not let people who cannot even define what they have come and redefine what you have. Because the ones who push you will not be there to carry you when everything falls. I am the proof of that. I learned the hardest way possible. The voices will not stay to help you rebuild. They only stay long enough to watch you destroy it. So I am asking you to learn from my pain instead. Be careful who you allow to sound like your own thoughts. Guard what you have been given, because once it is gone, no amount of regret, no amount of tears, no amount of sitting by a hospital bed and whispering, "I'm sorry," can bring it back. Because sometimes the damage is not what they said. It's that you believed them.